Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second session for today's Yes Speaker series. I'm excited to be joined this afternoon by Stüssy Tschudin, who will help us master the art of the pitch. Now, before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which George Brown College is situated is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and other Indigenous peoples who have lived on this land. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community and on this territory. Across the School of Design, we remain committed to identifying and removing systemic barriers to accessing college programs and services, and are committed to identifying strategies and tools and actions to better support our Indigenous student population. Now, in a commitment to build connections for students to engage with design's visionaries, Yes features a week-long lecture series, 18 to be exact. The design-focused speaker series has been cultivated in an effort to provide dynamic perspectives and unique discussion opportunities for members of our community, including students and faculty alike. Honest advice for designers from really good designers connects the School of Design community with those who have impacted the industry on a local and global scale through a focused thematic-based lecture. This is followed by an opportunity for conversation and dialogue using the YouTube chat. Please feel free to relay all of your questions for Stüssy there. With that, I'm happy to introduce Stüssy Tschudin. Born and raised in Switzerland, Stüssy was a Swiss banker by day and a graffiti artist by night. His passion for the creative ultimately led him back to school and toward a career as a graphic designer. He's a conceptual and visual thinker and brings creative and strategic insight to every project he oversees at Forge. His broad range of expertise includes branding, identity, web, marketing communications, signage, wayfinding, strategy, and conceptual development. Championing Forge's commitment to human-centered design, he's led projects for clients such as Apple Canada, the Gladstone Hotel, BMO, TIFF, and Lind Canada. His unwavering commitment to design and communications excellence led Stüssy to being elected to the board of directors of the Association of Registered Graphic Designers. Stüssy has served as president of the association from 2014 to 2018. Welcome, Stüssy. Moderating the Q&A portion of today's session is interaction design graduate Chris Kay. In her work, she's captivated by the subtleties of developing novel interactions for cutting-edge technologies. She delights in regularly diving into unfamiliar software, hardware, and literature in order to solve tough usability challenges from first principles. In her spare time, she's a digital fabrication enthusiast. Her practice explores the unmapped edges of art, design, and technology through the mediums of 3D printing, laser cutting, and apparel. She also enjoys using her time and expertise to facilitate high-quality learning. She's a member of the Program Advisory Committee for the Web Development Front-End Design Program at the School of Design, and her thesis project is an educational iOS app called Arbor. Arbor allows users to build their own memory palace in augmented reality. It helps structure self-directed learning by letting you link, organize, and visually search any type of digital content. Welcome, and thank you, Chris. With that, I would like to turn over to Stüssy, who will start with his presentation.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello. Welcome to today's presentation of the art of the pitch. As I've been introduced already, my name is Stüssy Tschudin. I'm an RGD, and I will be sharing with you some of my experiences that I've gathered over the years in getting ready for delivering a great presentation. I was born and raised in Switzerland in a small town just outside of Basel, and it doesn't quite look like this picture here where I live or grew up. This mountain here is called the Matterhorn, and this actually you guys might be familiar with from the Toblerone chocolate that was modeled after this particular mountain, which is one of the big highlights of Switzerland. In Switzerland, you have to choose your career path at a very young age. So at around age 15, I had to choose what kind of career path I want to go down to. And I was too young really to know what I wanted to do with my life. And so it kind of looked like what my father was doing, my grandfather was doing, and they were both bankers. So it seemed like the logical next step to become a Swiss banker. Did quite okay at it. I became the youngest stock trader at the Basel Stock Exchange and ended up doing that for a number of years. But while I was doing banking and wearing suits during the day, there was another part to me, and that was the graffiti artist in me. So at night and on weekends, I would spend a lot of time spray painting all kinds of surfaces and creating my own art. Now, after doing the banking for a number of years and joining for a brief stint the Swiss military, I decided to discover the world, and I joined a group called Up With People based out of Denver, Colorado, and I decided to tour the world. It was a musical group that's doing community service, staying with host families, and it was all about intercultural learning and bringing different people from different cultures together. And through those travels and experiences, I met my wife, Tamara, through that group, and she's from Canada, and that's how I got to Canada. Once I was done touring the world, did that for about 2.5 years, I decided to go back to school because I realized going back to being a banker was just not really my life. I would not be happy doing that for the rest of my life. So I decided to go back to school and become a designer. That's how I got to Toronto, studied graphic design here. And then I ended up working for a company of one of my teachers for the next 5 years out of school. And then in 2005, I founded with two of my business partners, Forge Media and Design. And you can see in the picture here, a picture of our studio and of our team that has since then grown to 34 designers, developers, and storytellers. Unfortunately, nobody's at the studio these days, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to go back there. Now, while we are all designers, we all end up telling stories. So we tell our story. We tell the story of our designs. We tell our client stories. Our projects are telling stories. And I know the next talk that's coming up by Ellen Lupton is going to focus actually even more so on storytelling. But I think for today's topic of the art of the pitch, storytelling is really also at the core of what we're going to be looking at. The art of the pitch. We are all pitching all the time. Whether you're a student, a young designer, or a seasoned professional, you'll have to present yourself and your work on an ongoing basis. So what are you pitching for? Are you pitching a school project to your teacher or to your classmates? Are you going for a job interview? Do you have to pitch your portfolio to a potential future employer? Or do you already have a client? Maybe you're a freelancer, or already have a job and you're doing a client presentation, so you're pitching your creative to that client. And especially in this past year and a bit, since a lot of us have been working from home, a lot of presentations have gone online. So are you pitching online or are you pitching in person? Those are all factors that kind of influence how we're doing our presentations. But no matter what your pitch is, one common element is always going to be time. And any of you who know me or research me, you know I'm an avid watch collector and I always wear 2 watches. So time is something that you'll see comes up multiple times in this presentation. So getting ready for your pitch. Every successful presentation has these elements that I'm going to be talking about in common. So number 1, you have to have a plan. Before designing or writing anything, sketch out the wireframe of what you want to present and how it all connects. You can see in the little side note my scribbles that I did in order to prepare for today's presentation, or at least one spread of the many scribbles that I took to get to it. Be prepared. Know your subject. Get images to back up your story and write the script. It's good to have like a good plan laid out before you actually start getting out there. Don't be last minute. We've all been there. You try to like get something ready the night before it's due, staying up half the night, and it's crazy. But while sometimes that is needed, if you can, try to plan as much ahead as you can so you don't do this last minute kind of thing, because ultimately you're not going to end up doing your best presentation as an end result, and it's definitely stressful at the very least. For the presentation itself, make sure you're on time. In fact, I would always say be early. Don't show up like with 1 minute to go, or like this clock here suggests. For this presentation here, I was here like 20 minutes before, just to make sure I can settle in, I can make sure my computer is set up, etc. And speaking of the computer setup, have a backup plan. You never know what's going to happen, like your presentation might not load properly, your internet connection might not work, etc. So plan for the unexpected. There's always something that can go wrong, and the more you plan for it, the more comfortable you are with what's going to happen with the actual presentation. And then once you're prepared, ready, and on time, you get to present. Tell a story. As mentioned at the beginning, when we present, we become storytellers. So know your subject. In order to present confidently, you really need to know your topic. If you present your own work, you should know your topic, of course, very well. And then make sure you explain the why and how you did something, not just show the finished solution. Know your audience. How much do they know about your work already or about the subject that you're presenting on? There's a fine line between over-explaining and being condescending. So you want to make sure, obviously, you're doing that perfect level of information. But if you don't give enough background, then people might not get the full story, and ultimately you're not able to sell your work appropriately. But also with your audience, like, find out what do they care about, and what is their sort of background knowledge about the topic in general. Can you use jargon, or should you use layman's terms? It's often easy for us as designers using terminology that we're very familiar with, but if the person you present to is the CFO of a company, they may not understand that. So you may have to make sure you use terminology that makes sense to them. And then ultimately, when you put together the presentation, I like to compare it to a movie script. If you think about it, like, movies are really good at storytelling. That's the whole premise of movie making. And so they have a very good way of captivating the audience, keeping them engaged and interested all the way from the beginning to the end. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm actually going to show a little bit how I would personally look at building a movie script. Has the same kind of values as building a design presentation. So when you build the story from the ground up, think of it a little bit like a wireframe for a website. I'm sure you've done that when you started a website project. You would start with just scribbling out the wireframes, etc. It really helps you to get the key blocks and the sort of the key things you want to hit throughout the presentation defined. So start at the very beginning. So going back to the movie analogy. So every movie starts with opening credits usually. So it introduces who's in it, who's what, who was in charge of which parts, etc. So similarly, when you start your design presentation, you want to start with that welcome message to the people. You want to welcome to people, introduce the key players, if there are multiple players, etc. Then every good movie plants that hook early on, because you want to make sure people get really sucked into the movie and really want to sit there and follow through with it. And so yeah, so when you do that in the beginning, the same thing happens with the design presentation. So you set the stage, you tell them what you will be talking about and what they will learn from the presentation, what their key takeaways will be. And then similarly to the hook, you want to give the audience some first big highlight early on, because you want to make sure they get really excited about what you're showing them, and that they essentially commit to sticking it out for the whole duration of your presentation. In a creative presentation, what I like to do is basically start off with a really strong piece. This really helps to get people excited about what you're about to show them for the rest of the presentation. Then you get to the main story. Obviously, now you have to kind of fill in the blanks. So you explain the rationales, you get into details about your design. You explain what you did, why you did, and how you did it. And again, assume the audience doesn't know what you did. I see often young designers doing presentations, and because they're so familiar with the design, they just kind of go to the things, the little intricacies that they focused on. But ultimately, the actual audience doesn't necessarily know why they did what they did. So it's very important to always go into the details, explain the rationales, and make sure the audience truly understands what you're talking about. Very important, you want to keep suspense until the end. Nobody wants to watch a movie where after the first 5 minutes you already know how it's going to end. So you want to make sure you keep something interesting towards the end of your actual presentation. So if it's a creative presentation, obviously that means keep one of your really strong pieces to the end so you can finish sort of with that big finale at the end of the presentation. And then to end the presentation, or like the movie ends with closing credits. And similarly, when you do end your presentation, you want to have some sort of closing credit as well. Now, you're not going to have a big scrolling list of names coming through, but you may want to thank people that were involved to help you make the presentation, but also thank your audience for sitting through the presentation and listening and learning from you. And obviously, if it's a presentation where you're presenting creative to like a client, for instance, let them ask some questions. They may want to have some clarifying questions or questions about you just to get the full picture before finishing off the presentation. Now, obviously, for the purposes of today's presentation, we'll be focusing on the right half only. So I made the analogy between the movie sort of terminology and the design terminology, but you'll see how that script idea is very similar in setup. So now that you have a good plan, what are some key things to consider when putting together your deck? If it's a portfolio presentation, maybe a little less philosophical and a little more practical, but what are some of the key elements to consider when putting together your portfolio? So I do a lot of student portfolio reviews over the years, and one of the things that I always find is most successful is if you start and you finish with your strongest pieces. And think of it this way. When you start your presentation, you only get to make a first impression once. So you want to make sure you get the audience really excited right off the bat as soon as you show the first piece. So that should be one of your top pieces that you show at the very beginning. And then you only get to make a lasting impression once too before you leave. So you want to make sure the one piece that they do remember is probably the last one that they see. So you want to make sure you finish on a very strong or your strongest piece in general. This really helps to ensure you put your best foot forward and you leave the best impression behind. In between, you have your other pieces. But one of the things that I think is very, very important is never show anything you're not proud of. I'd rather see somebody show me a portfolio with only 4 or 5 pieces, but all of them are stellar pieces, than them showing me 7 or 8 pieces, but there's 2 pieces that are just kind of there as filler pieces. So make sure you really select carefully what you're showing, only the work that best represents you, and also the work that is most relevant to the job you're applying for. So if you're applying for a UX UI job, then don't show a signage and wayfinding project. And vice versa, if you apply for a signage job, then maybe showing digital-based presentations is not necessarily what's most interesting to the viewer. One of the things that I find as a seasoned designer reviewing portfolios that I find incredibly interesting is if people show me some sketches or some research information. So for instance, let's say you did an app and you did all kinds of user personas and research on it. This may not be the sexy stuff to show as far as visual presentation goes, but it's incredibly important for us as designers to show how much thinking goes into these projects. So don't be shy to include that in your presentation. It's something that often is more interesting to me than the actual finished solution, because often if I see the finished solution, yeah, everybody can find a nice mock-up and make a logo look great on all these products and things like that. But if I see how much thinking went into that logo and how clever it was built, that is way more important to me, because even if like somebody maybe lacks a few skills of finishing the design, by showing how you're thinking, I know there is something to work with as a future employer. So giving a little bit of that background and even backing it up with sketches and things like that is definitely something that's very okay and helpful to have in your presentation. Run a spell check. I can't believe how many times I receive resumes or portfolios with typos in it. And it's typos that a regular spell check could have picked up. So make sure you double check all the spelling of your work. Another tip that I usually do, and I do this even for myself still nowadays when I send out important emails or presentations, is I have somebody else read over it, because it's hard to catch your own errors. So obviously you run the spell check from the computer, but if you have a friend that's good with English, or you have a family member that can read over it for you, etc., it's always a good idea to have a neutral party read through it. They may help you to identify errors that you may have missed otherwise yourself. And if you send something, just FYI, like if you send a resume out, especially with typos as a designer, I know in my pile, usually this is an instant no. It would be a very big uphill battle to still get even to the interview stage at that moment. And then for the presentation itself, do a test run. So you want to kind of time yourself. You want to see, does it flow right? Do you have the information you want to convey, etc. So not just put the presentation together and put it away and then look at it the first time again when you're actually presenting. Make sure you go over it and you go through it and you really get a good feel for, does it make sense, etc. Now, not all presentations are portfolio presentations. So obviously, we're also doing a lot of creative presentations. Those are school presentations or client presentations, etc. And often when doing a concept presentation, I like to show 3 concepts. There is not really a right or wrong number. We have gone in many times into a presentation where we only had 1 concept. If we feel like this is the right solution, there's nothing wrong to show only 1. And we've had other times where we did local concepts and the team came up with multiple great solutions and we ended up showing 5 pieces. So there is flexibility, but 3 seems to be sort of the sweet spot where you can do a little play with it. So when we do 3 pieces, typically what I've done in the past is I always like to start with an expected safe choice. So basically, when you're presenting to a client, you want to give them something that they feel comfortable with, that they know they can like. It may not be pushing the boundaries yet, but it's something that is a good design and that will give them what they need as an end result. And then with the second piece, I usually push it a little bit. And my goal is always to push clients to at least get to that second stage where they do a little bit more than maybe they're comfortable with before going into the initial presentation. But just to give them a little nudge forward. And then for the third piece is the one where sometimes we really push the envelope and we go more conceptual, more out there than this particular client may be comfortable with. And I've done this with a client many years ago. We always did that same approach with the 3 pieces, and probably done about 6 logo product namings for them. And by the 6th time, we didn't have the third solution, or we didn't like the third solution as much to show. We thought it was kind of unfinished. And so we only went in with 2. And the client has never chosen number 3. They've chosen always number 1 or 2. And so we went in with the 2 pieces. And then at the end of the presentation, everybody looked at me and they're like, well, where's the third piece? And I was like, well, we don't have a third piece today. And then they're like, oh, that's too bad. And they said, well, I know we never choose the third piece, but it's always the most entertaining one. So you can even set a little bit of an expectation with clients where they just, for the entertainment and education value, want to see how far you could push things. And over a 5-year span with that client, we really managed to shift their thinking. So their safe in the beginning was much, much safer, and they became much more advanced and design savvy after 5 years. So there's some real value in doing something like that. And I just want to share 3 examples of a logo design we just recently did at Forge, and that was for Liberty House. Liberty House is a rental building in Liberty Village that will be opening soon, and the company approached us to do the branding for them. So being in Liberty Village, we started with a very safe solution, sort of a hipster logo. makes sense in that neighborhood. It's not pushing the boundaries. It's something very familiar. It's something you've seen out there, but we wanted to have a solution where we knew the client was definitely going to be comfortable with. Then we pushed it a little bit. So we still kept very conservative and easy typography that people will be comfortable with, but we pushed the illustrative elements to a very abstract illustration of their building. So the building is sort of the left side a little higher, has a canopy at the bottom, etc. So there's a very abstract line art drawing of this building. And then last but not least, and the client that ended up choosing this version, we went much more conceptual. So we basically created out of Liberty House the abstract version of that building. And then the yellow lines are the two terraces. So there's a big rooftop terrace and there's a first or second floor balcony terrace at the end, over the entry at the bottom. But what we did also with that entry line conceptually is we also focused on the letters US as in us. Because when you're building a home, a rental or condo development, it's about building community. And so we wanted to really highlight this is about us and us being the people who live in the building. And the client was really enamored with the idea of the conceptual thinking behind all this and actually ended up going with our third version here. So after you've prepared everything, you're finally ready for the big show. So as you're getting ready for your pitch, you have to follow these steps coming up. First, research your audience. Really know who you're presenting to. If it's a personal presentation, like a little different than what I'm doing here today, when you're presenting directly to a small group of people, know their names. Know maybe their backgrounds. You can research them on LinkedIn or on the company website. It's always good to know something personal about them. So for instance, when I have people come in for interviews at Forge, I sometimes get candidates, they come in and they really looked me up and they may know about my watch collection or they may know the names of our office dogs or things like that. And it just shows that these people really care. They really show an interest. And by doing that, you show a certain respect and you instantly get respect in return. Dress to impress. This is, obviously, I'm not expecting you to dress up like a circus director or P.T. Barnum, but this is something that I think is very important to keep in mind, especially nowadays with most presentations being done virtual. Make sure you dress to represent yourself appropriately. Ultimately, you're not just designing a beautiful presentation or a beautiful end product, you're actually designing the delivery of your presentation. So how you dress is something that you should be very mindful of. And whatever represents you is what you should be dressing as, obviously. Yeah, there was a story that one of my teachers told me before I graduated from college, and that's why I chose this picture, because he said for the big graduate presentation, one of the students in the previous year was dressing up with a tuxedo and a top hat. And that's what made me think of this picture here. So he basically really made a big show of presenting things like that. And that was his style. Obviously, like I said, I wouldn't recommend that particular move for everybody, but just be mindful and think about it, what makes actually sense to really present, to put your best foot forward in that sense. We're back to time. Be on time, which means be early. Can't stress it enough. It's very embarrassing when you're late. Like, for instance, if you're late for an interview, that can jeopardize getting the job right off the bat, just by not being there on time. Test your software, especially with online presentations nowadays. There's always new systems that you have to present on, so make sure you test it before getting there if you can. If there's an app you might have to download, make sure you do that well in advance. Don't do it like the last minute. Make sure you have a good internet connection. I'm currently actually working from my cottage, and so I have 2 phones ready that I can hotspot through if my internet fails. It's always good to be ready for the worst case scenario. Check your headphones, make sure they connect properly. I'm switching between a lot of presentation systems throughout the day, and often the headphones don't reconnect. So I have always an extra pair as a backup ready, just in case. And once we finally go back to more in-person presentations again, and you have to go and meet someone, make sure you check the address well in advance so you know exactly where you're going. Check traffic, streetcar, weather, like make sure you basically ensure you can be on time and you don't have to stress at the last minute. And just as an example, like I've had people come to interviews in our offices in Liberty Village, and I've had people come to interviews from the suburbs, and they didn't know how long it would take. And I know some of them showed up like well over an hour before the meeting, and they just went to a coffee shop in the neighborhood to pass the time, but they knew they're in a 5-minute walking distance of the place where they had to be, so they didn't want to be stressed last minute. Again, it makes a good impression, and it also puts them more at ease. Like, so when they come in and do the presentation, they're calm, they're ready, they're not like sweaty and stressed out because they just have to run there in the last minute. And finally, you get to present. So repeating a few things from before, but if you're presenting to a small group of people, address them by their name. I'm terrible with names. I'm not good at remembering names. So what I do is at the beginning of the presentation, when everybody that introduces themselves, I write down their names on a little piece of paper. And if it's in a meeting room, I write down where they sit. So I actually remember exactly which person is who. And then when I talk to them or answer questions to them, I can address them by their name. And it just shows a level of respect again. And it shows that you care and that their name is worth remembering, basically. This one is always tough for me. It's normal. You do a presentation, you get nervous. And so what I end up doing is I talk really fast and ramble on. So I always have to constantly try to remind myself to slow down, speak clear, take break between sentences so people can absorb the information. And also, if it's a smaller presentation, people may want to ask a clarifying question in the process. Eye contact. It's very important to make eye contact with people. Now, obviously, through the camera, this is a little trickier. So in this case, look at the camera. But it just makes it more personal if you talk to the people instead of looking down at your script and just reading off the script, because that way people really have a good idea of like the emotion that you put into your designs and into your presentation. Explain the thinking behind pieces. Can't stress that enough. I think, especially as young designers, the thinking behind your designs is way more important than the finished solution in many cases. So make sure you really explain what you did, why you did, and how you did it. This is a mistake I see a lot of young designers make, and it's like one of the worst things you can do when you're presenting any of your design work, whether it's your portfolio or a creative presentation. Never highlight any shortcomings of your designs. If there is a mistake in the design, don't point it out. Often people say like, yeah, I still wanted to fix this, or I need to change that. And as the reviewer, I'm just thinking, well, then why didn't you? So either fix it or don't mention it. And if I catch the mistake as the viewer, then that's bad enough. But maybe you get lucky and I don't even catch it. So don't point it out. Don't put the viewer onto any mistakes if you can avoid that. And last but not least, lead the conversation. That's something that's tricky to do, and that comes with a lot of experience. But just as an example, like when I do creative presentations, like for a brand, for instance, we often start with a mood board. And we show a mood board in the beginning and sort of give them a bit of the inspiration that led us to this solution. And sometimes what happens is somebody sees some image on the mood board, say an image of a couple walking down the street. And for some reason, they think this is not the right couple or something like that. And then it becomes a whole discussion. That's not what the point of the presentation is. So we always have to try to steer them back to make sure we can really focus on the relevant elements, because you know what the presentation's focus is. And so while you take note and you acknowledge that they didn't agree with an image choice or something, make sure you still lead and bring the conversation on track so it can go on in the right timing, etc. And finally, in closing, you want to leave with a great impression. So you let your audience ask questions. At the end of the presentation is a good time, obviously. Like, then you want to leave some room. You build in your presentation, like whatever, 10, 15, 20 minutes at the end that you want to leave open for questions so they can really get all the answers and fully understand what you did. And leave with a well-formed impression about your work and you as a person or as a designer. Some people ask some questions throughout, but again, if you want to lead the discussion, it's harder if they interrupt you too often, so it's easier if you keep the questions usually to the end. Finish on time. That is a very important piece. If you think about it, everybody has very busy schedules. They have other places they need to go to. And so if you go over in your presentation, that may mess up their whole day afterwards, or they may just not let you finish. So try to be really mindful of other people's time. So try to keep it short enough so you can finish on time. And every once in a while, I get into these presentations, especially with clients we have already a relationship for, where maybe you get a little deeper into things and the presentation does run long. So when I see like 10 minutes before the end of the presentation, this is probably going to take a little more time, I ask, is it okay if we go 10, 15 minutes over today? Does anybody need to drop off? So that way they have the opportunity to excuse themselves, or we can say we'll reschedule another meeting to follow up if it's needed, etc. But it's best to like make sure to alert people. It also shows that you thought about that their time is valuable and that you want to make sure that they get to experience the whole thing. And then last but not least, thank them for listening. Essentially, you're selling them something, whether it's selling yourself as a designer, your work, a product. When you're doing a presentation, you're selling something. And for them to spend the time to listen to you is essentially that's something you should really be thankful for. And again, it shows that one final piece of respect from you towards your listeners or audience, and it will gain you that final piece of respect you need in order to come out as a successful presenter. So on that note, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in today. I hope you learned a few things about how to put together your presentations and how you can do successful pitches in your future life. Actually, hold on. I still have two more slides. Sorry about that. If any of you are interested in winning one of 3 one-on-one portfolio review sessions, you can go to our Instagram channel at Forge Media Design and like our one-on-one portfolio critique post. And if you tag 3 other designers, you'll get entered into a draw. And so then you get to present your own work, and you can do a little practice run and see if like some of the things you've learned today will actually be applicable and can work for you. And last but not least, now we're getting to the Q&A, because there may be some questions that you might have, and I'll gladly answer any of your questions. We still have 20 minutes, so we're doing well on time today. Hi, Chris, you're still muted. There you are.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. That was really insightful, and I really like how you broke down the process for us in such a detailed step-by-step way.
Thank you.
And a question I have is, what is one of the kind of simplest perspective shifts that really had the greatest impact on your pitching skills?
That is tough, actually. I guess for me, it was just doing it more often. I used to get incredibly nervous and I still get very nervous before today's presentation because this is a format I'm not doing very often. But in, for instance, client presentations, I used to get very nervous. But the perspective shift that I kind of mentioned in the presentation, I think that was the biggest thing for me, is to really know your topic. If you know what you're talking about, it makes it so much easier to competently talk about it than if you're presenting somebody else's work or if you didn't really think it through. So if you have a design and you really know why you did what you did, if any question comes up, you can confidently answer, whereas otherwise it might just derail you and it might be throwing the whole presentation over. So I think really knowing what you're talking about and being well prepared for it is key.
And how much time does that usually take for you? How far ahead of time do you usually start creating the wireframe, as you said?
So that varies. It depends often how much time you prepare. So for instance, for today's presentation, I started like a month ago. Most of our client presentations are usually within a couple of days before, because we often get a brief and then maybe within 2 weeks have the first creative presentation. So obviously then first you do your brainstorming, your sketching, etc., not for the presentation, but for the actual designs. So often it's just a couple of days before, but one key thing I think for me is like we always try to have it ready the night before. Even if it means a late night before, and even if it's an afternoon presentation, the last thing that I want to do is the morning of a presentation, still tweaking the presentation, because if something goes wrong, you're not going to have time to fix it. So my goal is always to at least make sure whatever it is, even if it's only 2 days before starting, the night before the presentation happens, it has to be finished. So it's clean, it's refined, it's there, and yeah, you're not chancing it.
Yeah, and you get to sleep on it and really process it. You know,
exactly.
get it.
Dream about it and then really be an expert when you deliver it.
Exactly. And you said the slow and steady. I definitely have a lot of trouble with that. I often go into a presentation, I sort of black out and speak really quickly. And any practical tips on how to work that?
One practical tip is you could put like a sticky up on your screen that says like slow and clear, and it just kind of reminds you every time you see that sticky, you're going to go like, oh yeah, I'm rambling again. I'm going too fast again. I think it's natural. We all do it, but I know good and successful presenters, they are definitely very calm and concise, and they take breaks. And I think the breaks is the biggest part. It's not even just talking fast, but it's also the breaks. Like I've seen it like when some of my junior designers do presentations and they have all their information and they want to get it all out and they go through it in like a fairly fast succession and it's perfect what they're saying, but they don't leave a room for people to breathe and absorb. And sometimes those little pauses are just as important as what you're saying, just so people have a moment to think about it, digest it, and then move on and like focus on the next thought.
And to develop that kind of rhythm, I feel like it can be quite challenging. Are there any, like in your, when you were starting out, did you maybe like listen to other people's pitches and then try to like recreate the pacing, or like how do you get a handle on that?
I mean, I don't know if it's I think earlier.
Oh, you're cutting out. Yes.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
So much for my cottage internet. So let's hope it stays this time. Let me just quickly let's get this here gone. Maybe that's helping. All right. So I'm going back to my earlier days as a designer when I was working for that other company. If I think back then, I was a more junior designer and I got to do my first presentations, but I really learned from my boss at the time. Like, she was doing most of the presentations. She was amazing at it. She had a real good rapport with the clients. She really got like personal connections going, etc. And that really made a big difference. And I think when I saw her do this for maybe the first 2 or 3 years of my career, and then first time was given the opportunity to do my own presentations with her in the room, in the beginning, I had sort of that safety net that she was there. So if anything would derail, she would kind of back me up. And then eventually it got to the point where I would do my own presentations. And then obviously when I started Forge, I started doing all my own presentations. And I think just learning from her was something that really helped me, at least, getting started, getting good at it. And I'm trying to do the same thing now with our designers. Like they get to present their own work, and I'm there with them initially, but then eventually, like we have a few people now, they're probably better than me. So it's nice to actually see them do the presentations, and they're so confident, they know their material, they have that good rhythm. But I think the good rhythm is it just has to be natural. It shouldn't feel forced. That's really the key.
Yeah, I mean, they always say that make it natural, but when you're just starting out and you're nervous, the natural isn't exactly the thing that's going to really be engaging.
Well, again, it comes down to the preparedness, I think, at least for me. Being well prepared, like I had my whole script written out today. I didn't necessarily read it, but I knew what I wanted to talk about. So, and then what I had on screen was basically just prompts for me. So like just using my own presentation as a bit of a sample here. Like I didn't write out the whole text because you don't want to write a lot of text. People don't want to read a lot of text on screen. And if you're just reading off a script, then it's kind of boring in the presentation. But if you have the script, you know your script, then you can fall back onto it when you get too nervous, but you can also just keep talking freely about the topic because you already know what you want to say. It's not that you make it up as you go. And I think that's really where a lot of this planning comes from. And I mean, the rest is just practice. I don't think there is like a magic pill that gets you this instant, I'm going to be good as of the next presentation, but by applying these
Okay, that last sentence was lost.
Yeah, I just lost you. I had a feeling my internet was going. And yeah, so something like practice in front of the mirror, for instance, where they present to themselves. Better now?
Yes.
No?
I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I moved the position of my phone. So yeah, if you, yeah.
Okay. Yes, I agree that there's no way to just make it happen overnight. But yeah, I guess practicing and having good mentors is key, and being prepared so the content is really deep inside your mind, and you can deliver it without really thinking about it and trying to remember, like read your text. What were some unusual aspects or mechanics of doing creative work for a company as large and as secretive as Apple compared to like your more average client?
Well, definitely secretive. You nailed that one, right? We were very fortunate when we got Apple. That was 12 years ago, and we've been doing basically Apple Canada's website and all their email campaigns since then. And our role, I mean, that's a little like maybe going back to the presentation. So when we originally got invited to the RFP, there was 3 companies that were invited initially. Ultimately, they looked at 8 companies before they chose us. But when we got invited, we obviously put our proposal together. We went in for the presentation. They gave us 30 minutes for the presentation, and we were done after 20. And we thought we totally blew it, and that did not go well because it was like we didn't even use the whole 30 minutes. So we were thinking, okay, well, we're still very young. We were only like 4 people at the time. We were a super small company at the very starting point. And yeah, so we thought this didn't go well, but in the end, apparently we had the best presentation out of all of the companies that presented. And about 2 months later, they came back to us and they said, yep, you got the gig. And from then on, it was more about basically under-promising and over-delivering. So we do everything we can to make sure every time they send us any project or any work that we do the best possible job that we can. And We can never take them for granted. It doesn't matter how many years we work for them, because there are other companies that would love to work for them, and we want to make sure we stay the ones that do this in Canada. And yeah, that's kind of it.
What was about that pitch that landed you Apple? Did you ever find out?
I think it was the personal connection, to be honest, because we did not have a very impressive portfolio yet. So I think like one of the things that we did is, and we still do that to this day when we do presentations, is we're trying to like talk to the people, not just present our material, but like make that little personal connection about who they are, how they're feeling, talk about the weather, something like just make a connection, because at the end of the day, like we're all people and we all want to be respected and we all want to be noticed. And so, yeah, if you make that personal connection with people, then you're already like a step ahead. And then obviously the work has to be good. And I guess what we showed for work at the time, it was a lot of conceptual work. It was highly creative work. And I think they really responded to that part. While we didn't have a lot of finished work, especially web developed, but the concept and our thinking behind our concepts, I think, is what really blew them away and basically made them choose us in the end.
And how much of the research and the concept and kind of the substance and backbone of your design do you usually pitch to a client? And because sometimes I find that you kind of want to show all the hard work you did, and it can kind of drift into, you know, almost ego, where the client doesn't care about some of that stuff, and you're oversharing.
It's a fine line, and it's something that there's not a right or wrong answer. So we kind of evaluate it based on the client. Like as a good example, like right now we're doing a branding project for a building in Ottawa, and we have like 20 people in a creative presentation from their end. And so there are finance people, there are lawyers, there are accounting people, building managers, all kinds of non-creatives that are in the room, and a lot of different opinions. So for those type of presentations, we actually go as little as possible into the background and really just focus on the deliverables. We want to make sure the discussion stays focused. It comes back to that lead in that conversation. For some of the other presentations, like we did for a medical clinic in Hamilton recently, a rebranding project, and this client is very interested in how we got to the solution and why we're doing things. So there we spend a lot of time going into the background. Now, we're not showing necessarily all the extra sketches and things like that, but we're definitely spending a lot of time explaining all the background information, why we did what we did, where it came from, etc. And yeah, that usually helps. But like as a good example, like to your point of all the extra work that goes into it, for that same client in Hamilton, we've done a naming project, naming and branding project for a product once. And in the naming process, we come up with 150, 200 different naming options. Obviously, don't want to show that to the client because not all of them are good names, but you like sometimes you feel like when you only show them 5 in the end and they're like, okay, I don't love any of them. It's like, do you have anything else? It's like, well, we have 150 more. You kind of want to say that, but obviously, like, always think about that audience. Like, what can they handle? What do they understand? And where you're just going to overwhelm them. And also, it comes down to only show them what you want them to choose, because the golden rule is a client will always choose the worst option. So if you show them one you're not liking, that's probably the one they're going to choose in the end. And so you want to avoid that as much as you can.
And what are some tips for leading the conversation the way you described? Because obviously you don't want to be rude or abrupt and just tell them, no, stop talking about that. I have this thing to say. How do you sort of steer it? Yeah. That one
is very tricky. Obviously, let them finish their sentence, acknowledge what they said. But often what you can do is like you acknowledge that they said this, like, thank you for bringing this up. We'll look at this later. But for now, let's focus on that or something like that. Like kind of try to close it off what they're saying and then move it forward onto track of what you want to talk about.
Yeah. That makes sense. And it looks like we're almost at the end here.
Yeah.
Can I ask a more personal question to finish?
Absolutely.
What is something really unusual or weird that you did or built early on in life?
As a designer, you mean?
As a creator.
Well, going back to my graffiti days, while I was with the musical group touring in the Netherlands, because they knew of my talent as a graffiti artist, they asked me to design a backdrop for a stage show for an amusement park in the Netherlands. And so it was a dual graffiti on, it was painted onto blinds. So it was probably about 70 feet across and about 12 feet high. It's a humongous piece. And it was all blinds. And then throughout the show, in the middle of the song, they would change the blinds and the message changed. So it was two different graffitis, but it was kind of interactive art before we did digital art with LED screens and things like that. So I guess like if I think about it that way, like nowadays we do a lot of these kind of things where we have these really crazy interactive multimedia digital installations in environments. And I guess that was sort of my first little step into doing something like that, even though it was very mechanical and hands-on and there was no computers involved at all.
That's fascinating, and must have been a challenging piece to work at such scale and
yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Very
Graffiti teaches you a lot about typography because you have to learn about letter spacing and spatial arrangements on pages or walls or whatever it is.
Very true. Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. I think the design field often attracts a lot of really introverted people who are not really like prepared to go up in front of a boardroom or whatever to pitch their work. So getting this information, these like broken down into steps is so helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being here. Best of luck with the rest. Bye-bye.